I mean, have you ever made mistakes?
100%. Lots and lots and lots of mistakes. But that's how you learn, isn't it? That's the sweet spot about how you learn, because those things, you remember your mistakes far more than your successes. The things you do well at, you're far more likely to remember those times you've embarrassed yourself in front of a client. You've said something daft at a meeting, and those things. I think the biggest learning points I have are definitely those where you've made a mistake or you failed. But the EPC, for example, I failed the first time round, and that was the best. Yeah, that was the best thing that could have happened to me, to be honest. So after uni, I got a first in my degree. I thought I was, there's an expression in Scotland, I thought I was Archie. My head was, massive. Oh yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing. When I came around doing the APC, I failed. And looking back, it was one of the best things that could have happened, to be honest.
Welcome to the Surveyor Hub podcast, the podcast for surveyors who just love what they do. I'm Marion Ellis, and in today's episode, I chat with Craig Ross, a chartered surveyor who many of you may know from his time working for the RICS in London as an associate director for the built environment. Craig's now relocated to Saudi Arabia and is the senior manager for safety and security at the Diriyah Gate Development Authority in Riyadh. In this podcast, we chat about the career shifts Craig has had over the years, his focus for ensuring the public interest is protected through a safe and secure built environment, and how his past experiences have shaped that view. So welcome to the podcast, Craig.
Thank you very much.
Now, when I get my guests, you're a guest, when I get my guests to book in, I ask you sort of a few questions so you can have a bit of an idea of some of the things we might talk about or see where the conversation goes. And it's been a little while since we spoke and met up. And it's taken ages to get this in the diary as well. And I record them in advance. So as we're recording this, it's December, just started December here in the UK. And this will probably go out early in the new year. So who knows what political changes there might be in the UK by then, or whether England have won the World Cup, who knows. But a lot has happened since we met when you were working at the RICS, and you're now in a different part of the world doing something a bit different. So I'm really interested to find out what you've been up to. But for listeners, because I'm useless at doing intros, do you want to just introduce yourself to those who are listening and explain a bit about where you started out and various bits and pieces, and we'll take it from there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally a chartered building surveyor. That was my sort of professional background, if you like. I started working in Perthshire in Scotland, and I was very lucky in that I got an apprenticeship at a chartered surveyor's firm when I was quite young. I was 17 odd. My girlfriend at the time had a beautiful little surprise in that my girlfriend fell pregnant, and so I've got a lovely daughter who's 25 now, given my age away. So that really meant that full-time university was out for me, and I was kind of thank my lucky stars that I found the surveyor's firm that took me on as an apprentice. And that was because I'd done work experience there, believe it or not, when I was like 16. Got on really well with the firm, really loved the work, didn't have a clue what I wanted to do before that. So really kind of fell into surveying, and it was, such a fortuitous thing, but absolutely loved it. Worked in Perth for a long time. I was with the firm for about 16 years. So, really kind of cut my teeth there and progressed through I did a part-time degree, which was great. So I did a part-time course in architectural technology first, because it tends to be project work the firm did, and then did my building surveying degree part-time. So there for a long time. And it was about that time I had a kind of put down as a midlife crisis. I wanted to run away and join the army. So I did. Took a bit of time out from surveying, and that's why I got into the sort of security aspect, if you like. I had tours in Afghanistan, loved that.
You literally ran away to the army?
Yeah, literally ran away to the army.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a bit of a change, but that was one of the main reasons that I started to get into the sort of security side of the built environment, if you like, and where things have sort of blended after that. So where are we? So army, then on to Dubai. So Dubai, this is about 2013. The crash had happened. It was all over the news. Dubai getting built and then this huge crash, and people kind of a mass exodus from the country, people leaving. And by that time, things were starting to really pick up again. And I'd had a stopover in Dubai, and I thought, I like this. Got speaking to people there. Was offered a job as a head of a consultancy team, which I took on very quickly. found myself in Dubai working on building surveying related projects in the Middle East. And that was so I've been in the Middle East really on and off since then, apart from when I met you when I was working at RICS. We came back to London and worked for a little while for RICS as Associate Director of Built Environment, working with a guy called Gary Strong in the standards team, and then made the decision to go back to Dubai. So kind of jumped back and forward a little bit between the UK and the Middle East. And then more recently went to Saudi. So joined the Diriyah Gate Development Authority team in Saudi Arabia in September this year. So that's where I'm joining you from today, old sunny Riyadh.
Yeah,
It's a very historic.
Oh, there's so many things I want to unpick there. But firstly, I'm just jealous that you're somewhere quite warm, although you seem to be wearing a jumper, which makes me feel a bit more.
It's because the air conditioning in the office, they love to keep it super cold. It is freezing. So outside it's nice and hot. Inside I'm wearing a jumper, which is
making you feel like you're at home, Craig. That's what it is. That welcome. That's really interesting. Can I ask, when you in your almost like your first career, when you were doing the building surveying at the first firm, was that residential or was that commercial, or what kind of?
It was mixed use. I mean, to be honest, the focus was probably more on the project side of historic buildings. So the guy who owned the office, Henry, had an awesome client base, some very wealthy people and some very big projects, residential projects mostly in Scotland and all over the UK, typically listed buildings. So yeah, it was really more of that kind of work. So a lot of survey work in terms of measured surveys, a lot of architectural designs, but there was architects in the office working with us as well, and condition surveys. And the condition surveys were usually done as part of that refurbishment package or extension package, but it was.
So that's where all like the understanding how projects work really sort of came into its own. What I find really inspiring actually is that you've had actually quite a lengthy career, was it 15, 17 years you said, and then you moved to do something else. And I was chatting to another podcast that we've got coming up with a chap called Bill Jones, who was on governing council, but actually now works out in Singapore. But he used to work for, I think it was like Warrington County Council or something. I was looking through on his LinkedIn and thinking, God, that sounds like I didn't say this in the podcast, but it sounds like a really boring job working for the council for 20 years. And then he just went up and traveled the world. And for me as I feel like I'm in my second swing, if you like, of a career, thinking, wow, maybe I will get to travel the world one day, because I was promised it on governing council, but with the virus, none of it.
Oh, the wrong time to be on the governing.
Wrong time or right time, given what we had to sort out. But it was just like, that world travel. That must have been quite a big move to go and do that. Had you ever travelled much? I mean, all right, for your work you might not have, but had you been a globe trotter in other sense?
Yeah, to some extent, but not really to that part of the world. It was travelling for holidays more than anything else. It wasn't like travelling to there but certainly not that far afield for work. Sometimes abroad, but certainly not that far afield. So yeah, it was a bit of a leap of faith, to be honest. There was a lot of conversations going back and forward with the employers, two of whom were British, and they talked through their own experiences. They had a very good HR team that talked through the process of coming out, what to expect, how they assist with getting accommodation for the first little time. Because it is a big commitment when you think about up in sticks and moving house. It's difficult enough when you're moving country, but to decide what you do with your stuff.
And were you doing that sort of by yourself, or did you have family that was moving with?
By myself. Yeah, by myself. Yeah, so which made it a lot easier, to be honest. I mean, this time round, when I do have a family, it's a lot more difficult. There's a lot more complexity to try and factor into the equation. But that was relatively easy, I think. It's a big commitment, but definitely worthwhile.
And I've actually just remembered we did an earlier podcast with two ladies, Joanna and Clementine, who actually work out in Dubai. And for me, it just seems like such an alien concept to move out of my little Victorian terrace and to live somewhere else. But I'm gonna sort of open my eyes a lot more, and maybe we will travel. But it is a big move, and I guess no matter whether you're moving country or just moving job, you said it's a leap of faith. You've got that certainty, that comfort zone. You know where you are. And surveyors we're not very risk averse, or rather we are risk averse. We don't like to take big leaps of faith like that. but I guess the opportunities come along. What sounds like made a difference, though, is sort of helping you settle in and get organised, where to live and those things must have made quite a difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right. We take calculated risks, don't we? And yes, that was probably one of the craziest decisions. And certainly moving over on the plane, I kind of came to thinking, oh my God, like this is me moving to a different country for a long period of time. But yeah, most firms, certainly the more established surveyors firms, do have that kind of package where they understand that people, especially expats moving from abroad, need that kind of support. And generally speaking, you will have some kind of relocation package, and they'll assist you with things about to stay temporarily, and assist you with the process of getting your visa and getting your residence and all that stuff.
Mm. So what kind of, and you were obviously chartered then, so did your chartered status then help you get the role, I suppose?
It did, yeah, for the role, definitely. I mean, they were after a chartered building surveyor with experience of leading a team, and that was the kind of crux of the start of the conversation, if you like. Definitely an essential part all the heads of department. It was a multi-discipline surveying firm. So we had residential valuations, commercial valuations, with plant and machinery, project development consultancy team, all headed up by chartered surveyors, which was great.
Mm. I just want to touch on, you said you sort of studied part-time for your degree and qualifications. How did you find that? Or any sort of tips for listeners? Because I took a few years out before I then got my degree. It took forever to get chartered, getting the right work experience and things. And I know there's a lot of students of learners, trainees, wherever they want to call themselves. And when people are studying part-time and working, it's as hard as hell, but you're building up the most amazing resilience and adaptability. And when I see people who've done that, not that it's easy just to go through school and then, get qualified, but it's character building in many ways, but it's really hard. How did you find it?
Yeah, in terms of time, it was tough, I must admit, because you're working full time 4 days a week, and you're doing it's not like a full time degree that's getting squeezed into one day. It takes a bit longer. I think overall the actual degree part took me 6 years instead of, I don't know what a degree is. It's like 3 or 4, isn't it, for your normal bachelor's degree? So there's a wee bit of extra time to fit it in. There was a lot of study at night, obviously, but I think the benefit of doing a part-time degree is you're applying what you're learning at university in real time at your job. And certainly I found that there was a few of us studying part-time, and they all did really quite well when it came to exam time. I think, number one, we tended to be a wee bit older as well. The students are, straight from school and going through that party kind of time, whereas the more seasoned veterans like us were we missed out on that, but you certainly focus a lot more time on your studies, and because your boss is paying for your studies, you certainly apply yourself a bit more, I found, anyway.
And I see that actually a lot on the residential side. We have a lot of people, come into residential surveying as a second career almost. But I think, again, that's great because you bring that life experience with you. And when you're dealing with, particularly on the residential side, you walk into people's homes, you walk into their lives, and you don't know what you're going to see or what you're going to have to deal with. And sometimes we feel like social workers or whatever, but you've got to be able to emotionally process that, even if it's not bad stuff, and I think that maturity really, really helps. Can I ask you about working at RICS, or rather what made you want to do that? You worked, you then had time out and you went to, in the army you were in? Yeah. And then how did the working with RICS come about?
So that, two reasons really. At that point, I'd done 5 years with my firm in Dubai, and it felt it was time for a change. So after 5, they don't typically have a pension scheme there. They're called end of service gratuity. It's a legal requirement for your company to pay you X amount when you leave. That jumps up after 5 years. So a lot of people will do 5 years before they consider moving on. So the 5 years was coming up. It was time to relocate. My wife at the time was pregnant. We were expecting a little boy. And I saw that we were talking about going back to the UK. We saw the position being advertised at RICS, and the stars aligned again. And that was really it. I flew over to London to meet Gary and Ken, who was the head of the department at that time, to discuss the role. We talked through my experience, et cetera, and that was it. Signed up, and it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed my time at RICS.
So what year was that?
The end of 2018.
2018. And were you involved in the Grenfell or
Yeah.
any?
Yes. Yeah, quite heavily. So Gary is, after Grenfell, there was a huge focus at RICS on the fire safety front, and Gary's role really sort of changed to fire safety lead, and there was a lot of core building surveying things that were getting left as a result. So hence the reason for hiring me as the associate director for built environment. But I found more and more I was getting involved with Gary on the post Grenfell response. I think you're probably aware there's a lot of working groups on competence, on new regulations on the Building Safety Bill, Fire Safety Act, etc., etc. So we really had to split our resources over those things. Really, really interesting time, very worthwhile work, obviously. A lot of collaboration with other professional bodies and government and everybody else that had a stake in the new fire safety regulations. So really interesting time.
And I guess, where we're still talking about Grenfell as we record this, it's now coming to the end of the inquiry. So there'll be more that comes out from that. What I always find frustrating is that sometimes we can be very reactive. Something happens and then we go back and look at regulation standards. It's not just RICS, it's across everything. Then we go back and have a look and check and see. And I do wonder, why can't we just flip it around and think, when we're creating these building regulations and putting these things together, that we can't join the dots? Why is it so hard to join those dots beforehand, or at least create that environment? Because we see it, at the moment here in the UK, we're talking a lot about spray foam insulation and how, whether it's good or not, and all of those things. And it's quite tense, I think it's fair to say. But it's all, reactive. We've got a problem now. We've got to sort out, the rules and regulations, the policy, not just for surveyors, but for installers and others. And the public are at a disadvantage, because even if they bring in new regulations and standards and ways of doing things, you've still got people who have problems in their homes or whatever. That just might be for saying I'm frustrated. But do you see that? How do you say to that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Marion. There is a degree of reactivity, isn't there? There's something's got to happen for there to be a fairly big shift, I think. There's a few reasons for that, isn't there? I think sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's very financially driven, and unless there's a real impetus for people to change their working practices or do something differently or create new regulations that make a significant change, there really has to be some kind of government push drive behind it, or a health and safety thing like Grenfell that's really a combination of both. But yeah, you're right. The competence thing especially is something that can, there's lessons to be learned, and not just in fire safety from Grenfell, or the spray foam insulation from products that are causing problems. And I think surveyors can see it. They're often the first ones to notice there's an issue, and you're doing multiple inspections or surveys or whatever it is, and you see recurring problems. That's where you start to recognise them and say, the spray foam matter. That was something that was brought up a few times when I was working at RICS, and that's a project that Sam Piplica, who's taken the role with Gary after I left, is really kind of pushing forward with that. It's very difficult, but you've got installers who are fighting tooth and nail to keep those kind of products in the market, whether that's ethical or not. I'll let you decide that. But
I guess you've got a piece of technology, whether it's spray foam or computers or whatever, that has the potential to do good. But if you don't join the dots of how is this going to be used, what's the current housing stock like in the UK, pull all of those bits together, then you can just see where the gaps happen, or the loopholes where the cowboys can come in and do whatever they do. It just creates opportunity for things to go wrong. What other kind of things did you work on while you were at RICS?
There's a few guidance notes, technical due diligence stuff, and that was a big part of the role, was working with members. It was a strange time when I was there. So remember, they used to have the professional group boards, and there was a drive that kicked off before I started, called Professional Groups 2020, when RICS decided to remove the professional group. And it wasn't a very popular choice, to be honest. So there was a bit of firefighting to do with that. And a lot of the meetings that I first had was a lot of chest poking going on. You're like, RICS, what did they do for me? Those kind of conversations. But a lot of those were very positive discussions in that, look, we as a group have identified this particular problem. What can we do about it? And that was a very rewarding part of the job, working with members who were, at the sharp end, at the coal face, what we're going to call it, experts in their particular field, developing something worthwhile that made our profession better. And that was very rewarding. So guidance notes were typically the way that those things are communicated. And that was for a range of topics, with PPM, technical due diligence.
I think it's, as we're talking now, we're sort of post-Levitt and Bishard, and there'll be a new leadership, hopefully in 2023 at RICS, and it's definitely, hopefully moving in the right direction. But you're absolutely right. If we don't, one of the key things I think is, however RICS is managed and run as an organisation, a membership organisation, if we don't have the people doing the job, the technical experts in whatever shape and form, having a place where they can have a voice and come together, then how on earth, are we going to get the right rules, regulations, standards, and see that as a proactive, supportive thing going forward rather than reactive? You've been told off, you've got to do it this way. I think most members of any, professional organisation, I don't think this is exclusive necessarily to RICS, and a lot of surveyors are members of other organisations. It's being able to share what we're seeing, those really early trends. It was ages ago you were at RICS and they were talking about spray foam. We've been talking about spray foam in the Surveyor Hub for forever. And yet now it's only come to a point because it's come to a head. So it's been able to nip those things in the bud, or at least provide some thinking and thought leadership. But, sometimes I did a podcast with Professor John Edwards. We were talking about retrofits and things, and he was saying quite rightly that some of the technology, the methods, the things that we're doing, we don't know actually if they're going to work long term. We think they do. And so you've got to have those checks and balances. And that's something that often worries me is, do we have the right rules and how do we stress test them, I guess, and keep the conversation going so that it's never a static, rule. I know that makes it a lot easier sometimes and gives people certainty, and lenders certainly certainty, but we've got to keep it's a moving piece, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very much a moving target. And that's a really good point on the retrofitting aspect. I know John quite well. He's sat in some of the RSS groups. He's an expert that we would lean on quite heavily for input, especially into the retrofitting thing. That's a case in point where there is a bit of test and adjust. You proceed with the guidance that you have. You maybe have to adjust that guidance. You maybe have to change the working practices when you start to realise defects. But that's probably one of the most significant concerns at the moment, isn't it? The amount of retrofitting they'll have to go on, and the implications of that, having professionals that know what they're doing, providing advice rather than people just jumping in and starting to spray insulation all over the place and stick insulation on external walls. John's got some fantastic photos of really bad retrofit insulation projects that he shared with me once for a
But, on the one hand, on the commercial side, it seems, or it feels a bit more organised, and commercial property is a lot easier because you haven't got people in the way in terms of, consumers and people living in their homes. And so that always makes things a lot simpler, or more complex when you're dealing with the residential side of things. And again, we've not long had the news about the little boy who died of mold inhalation in the UK. And we can go and give advice, but we've also got to look at that whole piece together and remember the business and we're in. Something that I remember talking to Malcolm Hollis about, we've always got a bit of a joke, what can you repair with flash band and duct tape? And I even asked him that on the podcast. I think it's one of the most embarrassing moments because apparently he's really bad at DIY, I think. He's a bit of a potter, or he was, bless him, a bit of a potterer, tinkerer. But when you see these sort of DIY repairs, and it's very easy, I think, as a professionals to criticise that. But ultimately, some people are just doing their best they have no money, and this stuff will stick or glue it down and it'll get them through. And there's a big sort of education piece in terms of built environment, how to look after, homes. We're not taught that stuff in school. We're not taught how to cook. So we have Jamie Oliver in his books teaching us in Dinner Ladies and everything, and maybe there's more of that we need to start to look at,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, especially homeowners. Sometimes it's the least expensive option. That's just reality, isn't it? Especially now with the cost of living crisis and the energy prices going through the roof and whatnot. You're going to want to do something. And generally speaking, can you afford a chartered surveyor to come along and give you advice? Sometimes it's just not the case. I think RICS has got a popular or well-known enough voice, let's say, to make their view on those things. They've got things like consumer guides that really need to be pushed out that I think are a great idea, where people can understand what they maybe need to do and at least make a kind of more educated decision about what they're going to do before they go to the expense of getting a professional in and, going down a particular road.
Yeah, I think that's, they're there to act in the public advantage. And if we can't give certainty on certain things for lots of different reasons, what we can do is help people ask the questions. And a great website for people listening to check out, there's a lady called Kate Faulkner who is in the Surveyor Hub, and she commentates. She's not a surveyor, but she's probably one of the best surveyors, best non-surveyors we have. And she talks a lot about the property market, but she has a website called propertychecklists.com or .co.uk. And it's checklists for properties, questions to ask, things to do, and people love a checklist. And I think that's the kind of thing that we as surveyors can contribute to, or RICS could even start to get to, because you don't have to give people the answer, if we haven't got it. That's okay. People just want some guidance and to be able to feel empowered to go and do the next thing, don't they? You talked about security and getting involved in security. And when I read this, I'll be honest, Craig, I started to think about, I don't know whether you've seen it, that TV program in the UK called The Bodyguard. And there's this Scottish guy and he's involved in security with the Home Office and things get blown up. And I just thought, security, built environment, that's Craig. And that's the vision I've now got in my head, which is quite flattering. But tell me a bit about what's the kind of work that you do, because I'm really interested in, the Army veteran side, because there's quite a lot of, I know we've got a few networks in the Surveyor Hub, and there's a group on LinkedIn of veterans who are looking to work and move over. And I think surveying's a brilliant profession in all the different guises and lots of skills. But how did that sort of come together, and what does built environment security look like?
Good question. So this built environment security is something that's always there. And regardless of the size of project, for smaller projects, domestic size projects, there's things that's mandated by the building regulations. You've got to, the very obvious things, locks on doors, alarms, that kind of stuff that you might expect to see on larger projects, what we call iconic buildings where there's, a direct terrorism threat. There's probably things that's maybe less so obvious in terms of how security is planned into a project. Certainly on master plans, I'm working over here as a master plan, that you've got a whole load of different disciplines who advise on the architecture, on the sustainability, on waste management, all sorts of things that get built into a project from the planning stages onwards, and security is very much one of them. In this region, it's mandated by law that there's certain things have to happen. There's a higher commissions for industrial security here, for example, that set standards. There's the Ministry of the Interior that sets standards for CCTV and whatnot. No different in the UK. There's regulations that people have to follow when it comes to critical national infrastructure, for example. So it's really security in the built environment, something that you often don't see. And I find that quite interesting, where, especially if you're doing surveys as a building surveyor of commercial offices, those kind of things might not be apparent, and it's important to understand what kind of security might have been designed into a building that you're not instantly aware of.
And can I ask quite a naive question? What was about security? Is this threat to life, terrorists, earthquakes, burglars breaking in the back door?
Yeah, the whole lot. So typically, the stepping stone would be a security threat and risk assessment, and that's where a security consultant, it depends on who's working on the project. This might be the master planner, it might be an individual consultant, it might be part of the architectural practice, will do a risk assessment. And typically this will fall into two categories. So the terrorism is, very low likelihood. You hear a lot of interesting sort of facts and figures. You're more likely to be killed by a vending machine than you are a terrorist, but the impact is such that, people, it could be a lot of people could be killed or injured. Crime is the opposite. It's very high likelihood. You're far more likely to have somebody breaking into your house or breaking into your building or stealing your laptop or whatever. But the impact is generally, it's a, could be a financial thing. Somebody's lost a laptop. It's no, in the big scheme of things, it's not a big deal. So that's generally the starting point. Somebody will identify the threat for a particular project that gets translated into some kind of risk assessment, and then a strategy will be developed for the building to counter those things, perhaps in combination with external stakeholders like the police or, for more iconic and larger buildings, some kind of response unit. And that's really the sort of thought process.
And does that also then include the design and layout, but then also the construction materials? And that's where I guess the fire safety thing starts to then come in, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlaps, especially with fire safety. So the kind of the ironic thing, if you like, is security is more concerned with keeping people out, and fire safety is more concerned with letting people out. There's a bit of a conflict. There's a lot of things that, especially for complex projects, really do need a lot of sitting around the table and chewing over the best solution.
It's really interesting. My husband, who I sometimes talk about on the podcast, who doesn't really know what I do, and I talk about him and he doesn't know because he doesn't listen. But he works in transport planning, and I remember him being involved in the relocation of a football stadium, and he showed me this sort of CAD little graphic that, because they were working on how do we get like 20,000 people out of this stadium really quickly, and he had this like computer with all these little dots. And they just sort of, quickly came out within like 6 minutes or whatever. You could get everybody out and you can get them on the tube and doing things. And I remember just thinking, wow. There'd been a lot of hanging around car parks and bus stops and things early on in his career. And I thought, this is really interesting. But you're right, it's sort of the, yes, how do you get protected? But also then how do you get out for safety? And there's two sides of it. The other thing that comes to mind, and on a few things actually as we've been talking, and I see this a lot with my surveying, is actually customer experience. The way we, it's not just about being nice to people and having things done at the right time. It's thinking about, well, what's the purpose of the task at hand? What's the purpose of the building? Who are we here to help? And when I worked in residential surveying and valuation, I dealt with lots of claims and PVQs and you name it. And on the financial services side, they had this thing called treating customers fairly, TCF. And it was 6 principles that were brought in after the last recession of, it's not consistency of service as much as, be kind and let everybody be aware of things. But it was about consistency. And being working for a panel firm, even though we weren't regulated by them, our clients were. And so I'd try and align ourselves to it because it would help make our clients' lives easier, that they could tick boxes for their regulator. I would look at things and say, there is a risk there's a risk that could go wrong. There's a risk that this could happen. And that's when you start to then mitigate, well, what can you do? Rather than thinking it's gone wrong, how do we fix it in a reactive way? But look at everything. There is a risk that the customer doesn't get their survey within 10 days, like we've promised. So what can we do? Well, we give them more than 10 days, or we find a different way of doing it. There is a risk that this could go on fire. There's a risk that. I think the more that we start to bring in some of those principles, there's a risk that, and this is what we can do about it, or at least explore it. That's when we start to get some of those ideas of how we shape and change things going forward. So actually security and me dealing with PVQs and complaints isn't that far apart.
And you're going through the same process. That's absolutely right. You're considering the vulnerabilities and things that could go wrong, and then the mitigations, how you treat that risk. Whether you change your plans to account for it, whether you transfer that to somebody else and get a fire engineer, let's say, to help with the fire aspect. It's exactly the same process. It's that thought process is absolutely crucial when it comes to complex projects where you've got multiple stakeholders involved. You've got 20, 30, 40 people sometimes sitting around the table, all with a legitimate stake. sometimes with conflicting viewpoints and kind of thinking about the potential issues that might arise, it's harder than you think. And, getting the right process in place is absolutely crucial. But yeah, it's the same process.
I suppose the problem is, though, if you then start to think, what is the risk? You get so bogged down in, well, bloody everything can happen, everything that can go wrong, that you become so paralyzed by fear that you don't do anything proactive. You have lots of caveats in your reports and mechanisms that stops you actually doing the job. How do you get over that and move forward? Sometimes you just go,
you've got to be, you're right. You've got to be practical. Benchmarking, is a good idea. You look at comparable projects and say, okay, they did this. It's never been an issue. It's important to know you can never cancel out risk completely. It's just, it's impossible to do it. You do have to take a practical stance, I guess, when it comes to certain things like terrorism, for example. Because it's super low likelihood, does that mean that every single building should have blast-proof windows? Every single building should have standoff distance? It just doesn't work like that. You've really got to focus on the risks that are most important to your client or the project or whatever you're working on, I guess.
And there'll be a lot of younger or newer surveyors listening to this. Here in the UK, everybody's a bit worried about an increase in claims, because when we have a recession, things start to go wrong. Not necessarily because surveyors are making mistakes, but when there's uncertainty out there, people get a bit scared and they react in different ways. And on the lender and valuation side, all the work we've done since the last recession in terms of better quality comparables, Rightmove and the surveyor's comparable tool and everything, we don't know if that's enough. And so I think that's actually really good advice for budding and young surveyors out there is, there is a risk to this job, but it is minimal. When I've dealt with complaints and claims across the board for lots of different types of firms, it's a couple of percent of all the work that they do. It's just sometimes it can be quite expensive when it goes wrong. But then you've got to design your business and budget for that, which is what a lot of the bigger firms do, and take that as a calculated risk going forward. But yeah, it's hard when you're learning to. And you don't want to make mistakes because you understand the consequences. Have you ever made mistakes?
100%. Lots and lots and lots of mistakes. But that's how you learn, isn't it? That's the sweet spot about how you learn, because those things, you remember your mistakes far more than your successes. The things you do well at, you're far more likely to remember those times you've embarrassed yourself in front of a client. You've said something daft at a meeting. And those things, I think, the biggest learning points I have are definitely those, where you've made a mistake or you failed. But the APC, for example, I failed the first time round, and that was the best. Yeah, that was the best thing that could have happened to me, to be honest. So after uni, I got a first in my degree. I thought I was, there's an expression in Scotland, I thought I was Archie. My head was, massive. Oh, yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing. When I came around doing the APC, I failed. And looking back, it was one of the best things that could happen, to be honest.
Was that because you technically didn't know, or it was just sort of maturity and attitude?
It was a combination of things. I take 100% responsibility myself, but the office I was in, it was a small practice. Nobody had gone through the APC process. Well, there was building surveyors there, but they've qualified a long time ago. The process was different. I had an architect as a supervisor, and that wasn't his fault. It was, he focused on what he knew. The APC is, there's a process, isn't it? There's a structure to each APC interview and how it works and what to expect. I went in completely blind. I chose a very complex project. I was working on a grade 2 listed building in London or near London. English regulations I was kind of familiar with, but not enough to be really grilled on. Stupid idea. I'm an APC chair and assessor now, and the reason I really wanted to do that was to be sensitive to people going through that kind of process myself, and give the APC candidates I was supervising the best advice. And choose a simple project that you know inside out. Don't choose something that you think is going to be impressive, and you're actually just shooting yourself in the foot. So.
And that's the hard part. I've been on APC panels and things as well, and I guess when you're coming new into the profession, you've just got that enthusiasm and just want to show that you can do this and you deserve this and you want to show your best. And maybe it is a little bit showing off, but that's okay. We totally get it. But it's like learning to drive and pass your tests. You don't have to do wheelies down the road or whatever. And it is learn. And that's not to dumb down the APC in any way, but if you make it easy for us as assessors to mark you, it's easier for us to help you ask questions, get it right. And there's nothing worse. There's two kinds of candidates that I used to hate to interview. Ones that were just really, really bad, but also ones that were just really, really good. Because
struggling to find
anything, and you meant to test their knowledge, and they know it all, and you just really want to have a good chat with them. But you're not meant to do that. So it can be really, really hard. Just to finish off, it's been really great to talk to you. I'd like to ask you about the kind of work that you're working on now. You talked about some developments and things.
Yeah, sure. So the project I'm working on is Diriyah Gate. So this is one of, I think you've maybe heard the term giga projects in Saudi Arabia. It's these big projects like the line. I don't know if you've seen the line being advertised. It's got I've seen it on getting advertised on the TV in the UK. So there's a move called Vision 2030 in Saudi. I think Saudi Arabia has realised that they can't rely on oil revenue forever, and they've got a diversification process underway. And part of that is the Public Investment Fund, a large fund that's driving these large projects that are aimed at attracting new business, new tourism, etc., to Saudi. So some of the giga projects are NEOM, there's Alula, there's Qiddiya, and Diriyah Gate is one of them. So it's essentially the way I describe it simply is it's a new city getting built on the western edge of Riyadh, focused on there's Aturif, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the Najdi style of architecture, your mud buildings rendered, very beautiful buildings. It was the original Saudi state. So Riyadh kind of grew from Aturif in the Najd region. So this project in particular is being designed and built on that very specific style of architecture. It's very interesting project, but it's given the sheer scale of these projects, it's a huge number of staff working on the project, a huge number of consultants developing the master plans with us. Things have started on site. It's very interesting. So that's where I sit in the master planning team. So myself and my colleagues work on the security strategy with, for example, the government bodies, and that the security procedures and strategy gets filtered down into the master plan and then into the individual plots. So that's it in a nutshell.
And in my head, I've just got, it's like creating Lego cities and building. And wow, exciting projects.
Very. It's one of the biggest. I think one of the excavations here where they're for an area called Diriyah Square is, I think it's the biggest excavation in the world at the moment. We had a site visit the other day and I was absolutely blown away. We've been looking at things on plans for a long time, and that you can kind of grasp the scale, but until you're on site in these projects, it's just absolutely massive.
And that's the thing, I think here in the UK, we have no idea of the scale. I guess we wouldn't do a project like that. I mean, the only thing I can compare it to maybe is, building the new towns that was, Milton Keynes, for example.
That's what sprang into my mind as well.
Or a MacArthur Glen outlet village, Vista, whatever it is. We just don't have that kind of scale here, do we? We're sort of making good with what we've got, which has a lot of challenges.
That's right. When the building stock in the UK is far more mature, and it's gone through that process already. There's been that huge expansion. When you look at the size of what London was compared to what it is now, we've had that big expansion, and we've brought an amazing existing building stock. Whereas certainly Dubai, Saudi at the moment, there's far more new buildings. I was
going to say, so it's all new. Is there any older building that's or are they looking to? Because even stuff that was built in the 70s, is nearly 50 years old now. And are they thinking about sustainability in terms of how do they manage that existing stock and not make the same mistakes we have in terms of
definitely to some extent. Some of the buildings, especially in Dubai at the moment, they're not that old, but they're they're getting to that age now where they do need a bit of TLC. The insides are needing remodeled. There's the fire safety issue. A lot of them have cladding that's combustible. There's energy efficiency. Those need to be retrofitted for other reasons, to keep the cool in rather than to keep the cool out, if you know what I mean. But yeah, there's a lot of work, especially in those regions now where the building stock is getting to that age now where it needs specific advice from Chartered Surveyors, for example. There's a very expanding market, let's say, in existing building stock, which is very interesting.
And you say Chartered Surveyors, and obviously the RICS is an international organisation. Some people don't like that. Some people do. Personally, having been on governing council and seen the benefit of, what goes on internationally and how we make that relevant to a surveyor on a wet Tuesday in Margate, I think is really, really important. We've always got to pay attention to that gap. But what's it like, being a chartered surveyor abroad? Do you really see the value of that membership and being able to use?
Yes and no. I think it depends on what surveying pathway you're on. So valuers, for example, the RICS is very well known. The land department knows who the RICS is. They understand the RICS qualification. A lot of people will understand it, especially expats, and they understand what a chartered surveyor is. For building surveying, it was slightly less so. And in that, when I first moved over to Dubai, second week, I thought I'll go down to the municipality, which is like the local council, and say, look, I'm a chartered building surveyor, just interested in the development process. Can you talk me through the process of getting projects approved? And I said that, they were like, what? Didn't have a clue what it was. Are you an engineer? No, then I don't want to speak to you. So it really depends on what pathway you're on. There's not a lot of building surveyors in the region, but there's a lot of excellent QSs. There's a huge quantity surveying market, especially from India, Sri Lanka. Fantastic guys, which really shows the kind of spread of RICS into that region. There's I can never remember the name of it. There's a educational facility for chartered surveyors in India that.
The School of the Built Environment. I think it used to be part of RICS, and I think it's now separated in some way. But can I? But even so, it's now somewhere else where people can get qualified, and it doesn't matter where in the world you are, to get through it and to get chartered is, does take. We all feel proud of that. Can I just ask then? So when if there's no rules as such, how do you approach a big plan like the master plan that you've got? What rules do people follow?
There are regulations, and there's for example, is the Saudi building code,
right? Okay,
the Saudi fire code. So there are regulations as such. I mean, it's maybe better to think about it in terms of the planning process. So this is really the sort of planning process, and developers wanted to build in the master plan go through our approval process, which is almost like planning permission. And then you have the municipality, or here we have UMA, who effectively check the building complies with the building code. So which is more like building control back in the UK. So there are processes here. It's just the roles and responsibilities are slightly different. It's very difficult to do the design work unless you're a registered engineer. Whereas, in the UK, if people, you could be a homeowner and submit plans to the local authority. No chance of doing that here.
So, not that one might be better than the other, but which do you think is sort of easier to navigate or better to?
Probably the UK, but only because I'm much more familiar with it. Especially the process in Scotland.
Well, it's all disco up there, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's awesome. But yeah, that's a fairly simple process. But I think that's maybe a bias on my part because I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah, but sometimes you just need to see what's the other side and how people do things to actually know yourself and what we do better. Oh, Craig, it's been really lovely to talk to you today. Thanks ever so much for your time.
It's been great to see you again, Marion.
Bye-bye.
Speak to you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes when you get a chance for the resources and links we mention in the podcast. The Love Surveying podcast is not sponsored, so I'd really appreciate it if you could show your support by sharing the podcast with others, leaving a review, or simply buying us a coffee. You can find all the details on the lovesurveying.com website. I'll see you next time.